Thank you for watching. Please do drop a like and subscribe. This is a difficult topic, but one that needs discussing. Drop a comment. Are Ukrainians Nazis? Almost 1 year ago today, the 24th of February, 2022, to be specific, Vladimir Putin and his forces invaded the sovereign state of Ukraine. We knew it was coming, we hoped it wouldn't happen, but it did, and for the last year that Russian potato-in-chief has been making life hell for the Ukrainian people and indirectly the whole world. So, what was his main reasons for this little outing in futility? Because to roughly quote Blackadder, it would have been far simpler for him to stay home and simply shot 100 men every day for the last year. In short, his goals were to demilitarize and de-nazify Ukraine. The demilitarization stemmed from the civil war in the East that he started, insisted on getting involved with, and which he grew by using his own men and of course funneling vast amounts of equipment to those militias. So, he assists with starting this mess and then decides to invade further to clean up the mess he helped create. It's brilliant. Create a problem, then act as the savior who comes in to solve said problem. The perfect reason for an invasion, saving the downtrodden and oppressed, and therefore in actual fact a large and elaborate false flag operation. He extended this ruse by accusing the Ukrainian government of killing its civilians in the East, and that as they were mostly Russian, he would step in to save them from annihilation. But if we take the incessant Russian involvement out of this, it was a civil war. The militias took up arms to overthrow their central government, rather than attempt a peaceful request for some form of self-governance. The government responded as you would expect any central government to respond, with a show of force and a complete lack of appetite for the breakup of their country. But like all wars, civilian casualties happen, and this is worse when you are fighting a militia that forms part of the civilian population and who have no formal infrastructure. Just to put this into context, approximately 3,400 civilians were killed in the Donbass from 2014 to 2021. That's 7 years. In just over 1 year of war, since the invasion, approximately 8,000 civilians have been killed. I think it's clear that Putin hasn't really saved anyone. In fact, the civilian deaths have skyrocketed since he took action. Then of course there is the Nazi angle. Always a good one to play. It strikes horror and fear into the hearts of all who hear the name whispered. Especially the Russians, who suffered tremendously at the hands of Hitler and his minions. This is the focus of our video today. To start, let's consider some definitions. What is Nazism? Nazism is a form of fascism, with disdain for liberal democracy and the parliamentary system. It incorporates a dictatorship, fervent anti-Semitism, anti-communism, scientific racism, white supremacy, social Darwinism, and the use of eugenics into its creed. Now, let's define ultranationalism. This is the extreme belief in your own country and support for its interests, especially at the exclusion or detriment of the interests of other nations. So based on these definitions, it's clear to see that the Ukrainian nation are not Nazis. Nationalistic absolutely, and some might say ultranationalistic, but not Nazi. The irony is that by its definition the Ukrainians have developed a watered-down form of nationalism, in so much as they are happy to integrate with those not intent on destroying their national identity. As an example, they want to join the EU and of course NATO. Both are more globalist in nature, a complete antithesis to the Nazi idea of nationalism. Nazism wouldn't allow the Ukrainian people to be tethered to outside organizations, especially like the EU, with a highly democratic, liberal outlook on politics. From what I can see, any form of ultranationalism is directed at the Russians and their inability to allow Ukraine to exist as an independent nation. They have, over history, consistently interfered, tried to dominate, invaded, and oppressed these people. But more on that later. So how would I define a Nazi state? The ability or desire to mass murder people on a massive scale, take hostile action against your neighbors, ostracize large swathes of your community, for the example LGBTQ, take a more isolationist approach to the world in terms of your politics, do your best to destroy the democracy in your country, imprison your political opponents, increase spending on your military, and of course lie constantly to hide the truth from your population. When they discover the truth, you crush them mercilessly. Personally, I think the only country that comes close to this definition is Russia. Go through all the points mentioned and just think about it. So are there Ukrainian men, embracing Nazi symbols, fascist salutes, etc.? Yes, 100%. It's true, there are neo-Nazis in Ukraine, just as there are in the US, and in Russia for that matter. But they are a very marginal group with no political influence. So, what does history tell us about the Nazi connection in Ukraine? On the eve of World War II, Ukraine was home to one of the largest Jewish communities in Europe, with estimates as high as 2.7 million, a remarkable number considering the territory's long record of anti-Semitism and pogroms. By the end, more than half would perish. When German troops took control of Kiev in 1941, they were welcomed by pro-Nazi banners. Soon after, nearly 34,000 Jews, along with Roma and others, were rounded up and marched to fields outside the city on the pretext of resettlement, only to be massacred in what became known as the Holocaust by bullets. The Babin Yar ravine continued to fill up as a mass grave for 2 years. With as many as 100,000 murdered there, it became one of the largest single killing sites of the Holocaust outside of Auschwitz and other death camps. Like it or not, locals played a key role at the site, rounding up and even killing. Currently, Ukraine counts between 56,000 to 140,000 Jews, who enjoy freedoms and protections never imagined by their grandparents. That includes an updated law passed recently criminalizing anti-Semitic acts, which shows that whilst Ukraine does have problems, the central government is trying to stamp it out. Sadly, Ukraine has in recent years erected a glut of statues honoring Ukrainian nationalists whose legacies are tainted by their indisputable record as Nazi proxies. One of the most infamous is Stepan Bandera, leader of the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists. This group acted as local militia members for the SS and German army. So how do we justify the glorification of these individuals? You cannot. But perhaps you can explain it. Ukraine has always wanted or demanded its independence and only got it in 1991. There was a brief period between 1917 and 1922, but this was quickly crushed by the Soviets, and it reverted to the control of the Soviet Union. What followed was a brutal occupation. There was the Holodomor, which Stalin caused directly, and whose name fuses the Ukrainian words for starvation and inflicting death. This genocide claimed the lives of around 3.9 million people, or approximately 13% of the Ukrainian population. A Stalin-made famine, it was the direct result of Soviet policies aimed at punishing Ukrainian farmers who fought Soviet mandates to collectivize. The Soviets also waged an intense Russification campaign, persecuting Ukraine's cultural elite and elevating Russian language and culture above all others. Then along came the Nazis, and nationalists like Bandera saw them as the answer to independence, and sensing the opportunity for local support, the Nazis played on this desperation, and I have no doubt that promises of self-governance were made. Knowing only the brutality and hatred of the Soviets, almost understandably the likes of Bandera fell into step with them, probably thinking that it simply couldn't get any worse, and most likely not being aware of the state of the wider war or the atrocities committed. The objective was clear: get rid of the Soviets and secure independence come what may. But as we now know, the cost of this nationalistic desire was horrific, and they became the monsters they hated the most. Subsequently, post-1991, having secured an independent Ukraine, and to rid themselves of their whitewashed Russian history, Ukrainians had to identify those from the past that helped them get to where they were and to formulate a national history. It was from here that those like Bandera started to shed their Nazi connections and become national heroes. At least in the eyes of their local supporters. In conclusion, I believe that Stepan Bandera was not a Nazi, at least initially, but I do believe he saw them as a means to an end, and as a result he was swayed by their evil to involve himself in some of their horrific actions, for what he saw as the greater good. To most Ukrainians, he symbolizes freedom, and that makes his memory a powerful one. The big question is whether you can believe in Bandera and not be a Nazi. I believe you can. The minute independence was gained, so the need to rely on Nazism became irrelevant as the goal had been achieved. You can be nationalist, whilst accepting that atrocities were committed. You can be pro-Ukrainian whilst also completely shunning any form of Nazism. However, their difficult history has become an easy excuse for their highly aggressive neighbor to wage war, and this simply cannot be accepted. War is the last resort and must always be avoided. In order to justify the invasion, the Russians see any anti-Russian and a strong determination for independence as Nazism because it doesn't fit with their narrative, and in this case, it is one born out the belief that the Ukrainian nation does not and should not exist.